This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest reviewer, Susie, on the Apple Podcast Store. Thank you for reviewing the podcast. You too can rate and review the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store or podchaser.com and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Another reminder that we have the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, and that is growing and thriving. Consider dropping in and letting us know that you are listening. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. On to today's show. My guest today is Hannah Ramos. Hannah grew up in a family that believed in the quiverful idea. She was one of 10 children. They were in the independent fundamentalist Baptist tradition. And as she grew up, she was dissuaded by her pastor from going to Bible college and encouraged to remain under her father's supervision until her Prince Charming came along. Well, Prince Charming came in the guise of Jose, her husband, who was, in Hannah's words, a very deep thinker and clearly God's choice for her as a husband. They got married, and as a young couple, Jose eventually took over the pastoring job from his father of a Spanish-speaking church. So they found themselves thrust into ministry. 3 years along, and Jose is having very serious doubts, and they end their ministry, and eventually Jose admits to Hannah that he no longer believes. Hannah decides that she will double down, that she'll focus on her faith and her children, but ultimately that begins to break down. The pat answers begin to be pat. And as she is looking at the Bible with fresh eyes, she can no longer believe either. So Hannah goes from the poster child Christian, the good girl, the good wife, to deconversion, and recognizing that the Bible itself has a very dark picture of the Christian God. A major part of this story is the love that Hannah and Jose have for one another and being able to remain married for 6 years as an unequally yoked couple. And it's fascinating to hear from Hannah's perspective during those years of being the believing spouse. In a couple of weeks, we will also hear from Jose and hear from his point of view as he is the one who deconverted first. But here now is Hannah to tell her story. Hannah, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Hannah, I think you reached out to me almost a year ago, and what I really appreciated was kind of recognizing you might need a little more time before you tell your story. But here you are, and you're ready to tell your story. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just newly deconverted when I found your blog and your podcast. And so I was probably maybe a month in or so.
Wow.
So I
Okay.
definitely didn't have my thoughts together enough to have a full conversation about it. I was still reeling at the moment. So
Yeah.
A year later, I feel like I have my thoughts together a little better.
Okay, great. Well, let's start with, what was your faith tradition when you were growing up?
Well, I grew up in a very devout home. My parents became Christians in their early 20s and felt that God had saved them. So they turned to God and never looked back. So I can say confidently that I've been in church since I was born because I played baby Jesus when I was a month old in the Christmas play.
You're famous.
Yes. So born and raised in church. We mostly attended a non-denominational, very conservative, small church. It was, I would say, closest to pretty conservative Baptist. It was King James only, hymns only, suit and tie, dress wearing type
Wow.
of church. So that was most of my childhood was spent in that church. And then when I was a senior in high school, my family moved to another state and we started going to an independent fundamental Baptist church, which was a little bit of a different experience, but those were the two churches I was raised in.
Okay. Just because you mentioned it, and I don't think I've talked about this much on the podcast, I always find it fascinating, the King James only groups. And
Yeah.
on the one hand, I get it. Like,
Uh-huh.
if you start with King James and then you read a newer translation, it doesn't have the sense of authority and and
Yes.
eloquence and that kind of thing.
Yes.
But the flip side of that being, it's a translation.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Well, I didn't understand all the reasoning behind it as a kid growing up. All I knew was this is the word of God and all the other translations are not.
right.
So I don't really remember all the reasons why, but it was definitely pushed that you should not read any other version.
So then growing up, were you yourself a dedicated Christian?
Yes, yes, very dedicated. I remember being scared out of my mind hearing the pastor talk about lukewarm Christians.
Oh
So
dear.
I determined to never be a lukewarm Christian so I
Yeah.
wouldn't be spewed out of Jesus's mouth. So yeah, I would say I was a very dedicated Christian. Um, I was the second of 10 children, and we
Wow. Okay.
yes,
Okay.
we dutifully sat in the front row of our church, taking sermon notes every Sunday. My parents drove an hour to church on Sundays because they believed that that church was the only good church to go to. So we were, yeah, very, very involved in it. I, from it, let's see, I professed faith when I was 7 years old and got baptized when I was 7.
Okay.
And yes, for the next many, many years was, I would say, a very dedicated Christian.
Yeah. Okay.
So back to my big family.
Yes.
my 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 parents, being saved in their 20s, they were just so on fire for God and wanted to do everything to, that he wanted them to do. So my mom started studying I don't know if you've heard of the quiverful
Yes.
philosophy. So she decided to, if other people don't know what that is, it's where you give your womb to God and God decides how many children you have. So thus there were 10 of us.
Wow.
And it was a good upbringing. We were homeschooled and church schooled. And
That's a lot of work. 10 kids homeschooling. That's incredible.
my mom was amazing. My
Yeah.
dad was a hard worker and a wonderful man. And my mom was very dedicated to God. She felt that God was her father and loved him with all her heart and thought, okay, God wants me to give him my womb and homeschool these children. And she did it. And it was amazing. I don't know how she did it.
Yeah. Wow.
I have 3, but she did it somehow. Anyway, and she was very dedicated to teaching us the word of God. We would sit down every morning in our little chairs and read Proverbs together. And yeah, she took it very seriously. And I have great memories. We had 6 acres growing up and would run around and play. And
Oh, nice.
yeah, and it was a good childhood. I look back on it with a lot of fondness. And then as I got older, we started going to our church school, which was very small. Only the church members' kids went there.
Okay.
But it was really good for being a small church. It was a good education. The teachers were volunteer teachers, most of them, and they were amazing teachers. So we got a really good education.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that. And I was like fully in. I was a good girl. I was a rule follower, memorized books of the Bible, memorized all the hymns,
Yeah.
had my Bible all highlighted.
The mark of a truly good Christian.
That
yes.
was what all the cool kids were doing. So
That's right.
that's what I did. We went on missions trips. I didn't listen to anything but Christian music. We were, in the purity culture. So
Okay.
definitely dressed modestly, got my purity ring when I turned 13.
Oh, wow.
I pledged to never drink alcohol, never kiss anyone before marriage, never have sex before marriage. It wasn't my nature to question anything, so I was fully in. When my friends got convicted to start wearing dresses all the time, I jumped right in like, oh, God wants me to do that too. I wanted to be, I wanted to do what God wanted me to. So I was wholeheartedly sold out.
I think that's really interesting as well, that there is a race to be the most observant, the most pious.
Oh, for sure.
And so, for example, like, your friends deciding to just wear dresses, then everybody has to do that, right?
Yeah.
The bar has been changed, and now somebody else makes another decision about, not listening to secular music or what have you, and then everyone has to do that as well, and it just keeps escalating.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, I definitely felt like that I needed to be the best Christian, and this was the bar that was set, so I did it. When I was 16, we moved out of state and started going to an independent fundamental Baptist church, which was not the best experience.
Okay.
So my childhood experience was great, like very sanitized, I loved it. But this church was a little different. The pastor was the opposite of my previous pastor, who was very a kind man. This one was, I would say, abusive, manipulative, controlling. Okay. He was your classic cult leader.
Wow. Okay.
But my dad is a very kind man who believed it was his job to follow God by following the church leadership. So he was not one to question things. He kind of fell in line. And so, my parents joined that church, and this pastor, I don't know if you know much about independent fundamental Baptist churches, but
only by reputation, but yes,
they're interesting. But he believed that he followed the direct line from John the Baptist, and any churches that didn't follow that line were false churches. So you had to be rebaptized if you weren't part of one of those churches. Okay. It was he didn't want people reading books besides the Bible. Didn't want people to go to college. Said, you can't make any decisions without the consent of the pastor, and if you did, he would get very upset. Wow. So we did everything he asked us to do, and I did as I was told, because that was what I did. So when I graduated, I had wanted to go to Bible college, but that was not acceptable in his eyes.
Yikes. So Bible college, too liberal.
Yeah, I know, right? I just want to go to Bible college. No, I believed that also that a woman should be under her father's authority until she marries. So I was like, okay, I'll stay home and live with my dad until my Prince Charming comes along. So that's what I did. I did exactly what my pastor would tell me. I didn't get like a full-time job. I volunteered in their church school 2 days a week. I cleaned the church myself. I taught Sunday school and was in the choir and did visitation, and just my whole life revolved around volunteering at church until my Prince Charming did come. So cue Jose. He was a guest speaker at our church one time. He was a Bible college student studying to be a pastor at the time. And I fell for him right away. Yeah. He was a wise, deep thinker, and you could see that through his speaking. Yeah. And you could tell, I don't know why, but I could just tell he was a trustworthy guy, and that was really important to me. So took him a little longer to catch on that we were meant to be together.
Did
At
not
the
get the
time,
memo early enough.
no, he didn't. But at the time, we would say God drew us together because we were young, and it seemed like, wow, how did this happen? But now we look back and we just are like, wow, we were really lucky to have found each other at a young age. But he was in Bible college at the time, so we courted long distance for 2 years. And then when we got married, we moved to his hometown, and his dad was a pastor and had been a pastor for 25 years of a Spanish-speaking church.
Okay.
So Jose was his assistant. And then within 6 months of being married, I was only 22 years old.
Yeah.
Within 6 months, his dad told him he wanted to go be a missionary in Mexico and asked if Jose would want to take the church. So, so he did. And we were there for 3.5 years.
That is pretty intense at 22.
Yeah, it was. But, when you've prepared your whole life for serving the Lord, you feel that you're just so equipped. Yeah. So I felt like, this is my calling. We were happy. We felt that we were fulfilling our calling. So I played the piano in services and taught classes, and Jose was very dedicated to his preaching. And I liked having him as a pastor. I thought he was amazing. But, so 3.5 years, though, it all came tumbling down. When Jose told me, I don't think we're meant to be at this church anymore. And I thought, I agree. I think we are meant to be at a different church. But he's like, no, not going to pastor at all. And he did tell me right away why. Well, you'll hear his story, but he was afraid of losing me. But he told me, I've been struggling with doubts for many years. And he said, I just pushed them aside and said, I'm going to keep pressing on. But he said, I finally have reached the point where I don't believe anymore.
Yeah, let's stop there for just a second. So, I mean, he's the pastor of this church as he's telling you this. Yeah. So I imagine this hit you out of left field.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. And what did you feel?
It was probably, the hardest hit of my life. I was young and in a sanitized little bubble. So I felt like I was reeling, as was he, now looking back. But all I thought about was myself, and our dreams were shattered. And I guess the biggest thought I had was, what's going to happen to our children? Are they now going to go to hell because they have a father that doesn't believe? I immediately felt scared for myself. Like, if he doesn't believe anymore, am I going to still believe? Right. I guess it was, 7 years ago now. So a lot of those feelings have, passed, obviously. But at first I felt like, my world was caving in for sure.
Right.
But that started a tumultuous several years. I know you'll hear more from Jose, but he was struggling to find his identity after losing his faith. And I know he felt very alone. And looking back now, I wish I'd been there for him, but I wasn't. I was angry.
That's a lot to ask. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the person who told my wife. So, I mean, I get it. It's a lot to ask of someone. So, yeah.
For sure. I know faith was everything to both of us. So him trying to find his way was hard. And then me trying to find my way of like, okay, having always been a follower that just did what I was told. Now I was like, okay, I need to decide for myself what I believe then and why. And I told Jose, I'm never going to lose my faith because it's everything to me. And I can't imagine living life without it. So that's not happening. Now I got to figure out how to navigate the two of us and how we're going to make it work. For the first time in my life, I had the paradigm shift. Usually people that I encountered that didn't believe in God were people I didn't know that well, and thought, okay, well, they just don't know the gospel. They don't know God. So I got to, convert them. But this
Yes.
was now, this was now a person who knew the gospel and
Yeah.
someone that I respected and someone I loved. So my paradigm now shifted from this is truth that I'd had my whole life to now, is this true? And that definitely planted those seeds of doubt. Like, I never, ever had doubted that there was a God or that my faith was the true faith until that moment.
Right.
Never once. So now, though, the seeds of doubt were planted for sure.
Man. Yeah. I want to just jump in. I want to hear more about that experience for you of the seeds of doubt. I just want to acknowledge that we will be interviewing Jose, and being a pastor and losing your faith has its own unique challenges. And then trying to maintain the relationship. It sounds like you guys love each other. That's amazing and fantastic. Yeah. And that's what's got you through this, it sounds like.
Yeah.
But I'm very, very fascinated about these early moments for you of, like you said, there had never been a doubt. You had been in a bubble.
Yeah.
And like you said, you have this sense that the people who don't believe, they don't believe because they've never heard the gospel.
Yes.
And this experience of now recognizing someone you love and care for and respect, as you mentioned, his wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he doesn't believe. And what does that mean for you?
Yeah, for sure. I couldn't discount it as much as I wanted to. I couldn't. And that made me very angry because I wanted life to continue as it was. And now it's like, wait a minute, there's got to be something to this. Like, I know, like, he reassured me, like, with all his heart, he wanted to believe, and he tried so hard for so long. So I couldn't discount that as much as I tried to. So I would be like, oh, you're just too arrogant to believe, or you don't have enough faith. And, all the justifications of why he would leave his faith, looking back now, are ridiculous. But at the time, I couldn't wrap my head around it for sure.
Yeah.
So for the next 6 years, I doubled down trying to be convinced that my faith was the true faith. We joined a new church, which was a cool church.
Okay.
We'd been raised in pretty legalistic conservative churches. So we joined a church that actually played worship music, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And the people there were so nice and so welcoming. And it was a great fresh start for us, for me to try to figure things out. I joined a bunch of Bible studies and really felt held by the women at the church. I didn't tell very many people. Jose did not come out. He just told maybe a couple people after a while, but he kept it close.
Yeah.
So at our new church, Jose supported me and went to church with me because he wanted to continue to be a family on the weekends. So he was very selfless in that. Now that I see the sacrifice he made, because I don't know if I could do that.
Yeah.
But we went to church together, and he knew I so desperately wanted a Christian husband. So he dutifully pretended to be one for me.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, he loves to sing, so he sang all the songs, and nobody would think otherwise. So,
which tells you something, right? Like that it's possible to just fake it.
Oh yeah. So we discussed it the first year probably. And then after that, I was like, we can't talk about this, because I thought, well, I could get him to read this book. I could get him to talk to this person, and, or I could convince him.
Right.
But it wasn't working. So it would just make me mad. And so we came to the conclusion that we should probably not discuss this ever. And sometimes I would catch his body language in church and be thinking, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
But I knew what he was thinking, but we didn't talk about it. So I would say, it took a couple of years, but I finally came to the place of accepting, like, okay, I'm not going to change him. I'm not going to bring him back, because at first I thought, all right, Satan's got him and God is testing me, and it's my job to get him back, and it's my job to keep my faith strong. But after a while, I realized that wasn't going to do anything. My prayers weren't working. Jose was long gone.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I gave up on Jose, and I focused on keeping my own faith alive and my children's. So I just let him do his thing and didn't worry about him anymore. But I thought, I definitely stopped trying to tell people about God, because if I couldn't convince my own husband that it was true, then I couldn't convince anyone else. So I had taken a step back from being as loud of a Christian as I had been. But so I was definitely confused all the time. It was like a mental seesaw, because I would think, is there truth to Jose's thinking? Or do I just need to keep pressing on and push through because this is all Satan at work, So I was up and down all the time. I would talk to people, and, their answers would help me for a little while, but then I would still question things. And it was a mental battle for years of struggle. And I wanted to have faith, but desperately wanted to, but it was starting to crumble.
The thing about your story, I think that is very relatable, is the impetus to double down.
Yeah.
So you have something that makes you pause for a moment. You haven't lost your faith at all yet, but it just makes you stop and think. In this case, a dramatic revelation from your husband. But the immediate response is to really double down, to do more work, to read the Bible more, to pray more. You're going to be the super Christian at that point.
Yes.
And that, I think, is very, very common. And it is for many people a delaying tactic.
Yes. I wish praying more and reading the Bible more had helped, but it made it worse. I thought, just need to read more. But every time I picked up my Bible, like I said, I had that paradigm shift of, is this true? So now when I read my Bible, it was a whole different book. Because and everything jumped out at me as like, oh my gosh, this is confusing. I don't get it. And so anytime I read my Bible, it was so confusing for me after that. I told Jose to read his Bible and pray, and that didn't work. And it wasn't working for me either. So despite my fervor, the seeds were planted and they were there to stay. My kids would ask me questions. They were very inquisitive. I have a 10-year-old, 8-year-old, and almost 5-year-old. So they would ask me about to explain the Trinity, and they would be bawling their eyes out because it didn't make sense to them. And they're like, how could God have always been here? How could he be three people? And they were crying, and I was like, I don't get it either. I don't have the answers for you. And I wanted them to just be good kids like I was and never ask questions, but they pummeled me with questions, and I was scared because I thought these kids are going to end up being atheists too.
Oh no. I need to respond to that as well. I find it fascinating that the cracks or the illogic nature of theistic beliefs can be revealed by a child. And
I know.
So
totally.
the irony of out of the mouths of babes.
Yes.
Because I think this happens quite a lot as well, both from the kids who ask those questions as young people and do become atheists later, but also in this case, legitimately just asking. They want to know. They're not trying to break your faith. They just want to know.
So I would get them little kids apologetics books, and we try to study them. But my son told me, he was like 6 at the time. He said, Mom, I think I don't really believe in God. And I was like, no.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And that was by no influence of their dad. He had never told them anything. This was just their little brains ticking. And it was amazing that they were able to see all the cracks. It was crazy. But I remember you had a guest on, Lars, who mentioned that he would sit in church and just wait for the pastor to say some big thing that would convince him that this was all true. And I would talk to my pastor and Bible study leaders and read books and try so hard. I waited for that big revelation that this is true. And
Yeah.
sometimes I would just, in desperation, Google, is God real? Is the Bible true? Just looking for a convincing argument. I kept waiting for that moment, and it just never happened. I kept hearing pat answers that did not satisfy. And I was honestly just getting tired of trying to justify the things that didn't make sense anymore. And I actually started to be jealous of Jose. Like he seemed to be so at peace and free. And I looked at that and I thought, well, how could he be? Like, there's got to be something to it. And here I am, like you said, doubling down, trying to be a good Christian. And here he's acting like a better person than I am. And he's not even praying. Yeah, I just, that confused me a lot. Like, he doesn't even have God on his side. And he's, being all this great person while I'm struggling.
Wow. One more thing I wanted to respond to is that search for, this can manifest as people church shopping. They're looking for the right church. They're looking for the right pastor. They're looking for the right small group, the right Bible study, and for you, it was maybe more explicit. You were looking for, is God real?
Yeah.
For some other people, I think it's under the surface and they're just unsatisfied, or they can't quite articulate it. And they're just trying to find something to convince them more deeply. So I think that's also a very common experience.
Yeah, for sure. So it was like 6 years. And then it was last year that I was doing a lesson for Sunday school on the book of Revelation.
Okay.
And I'm sitting at the computer typing away, writing down these things that I know they want me to say, but that I don't really believe. And it was there at the computer where I realized, like, I just don't believe in this anymore. And it just came crashing on, like, I finally realized it. I don't know how long I hadn't believed. I don't know, but it finally hit me that, like, I am done. Like, I'm so done trying to justify this stuff. I'm so done trying to have it all make sense. I'm just tired of it.
You are telling my story, man.
I wanted that peace of mind to be like, I don't know the answers, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So I said, I'm done. Jose was upstairs watching a movie or something, and I was bawling my eyes out, and I told him, I'm done. And he was super hesitant. He was like, oh, wait a minute. Because that whole time I had hidden all my doubts from him.
Right.
Because I had to be the strong Christian, and, it had to make sense, or so I could get him back. But it didn't make sense to me, and I hid that from him. So when I told him, I'm done, he's like, all right, wait a minute, let's just hang on here.
Yeah.
I don't think he wanted to get his hopes up, because he honestly never thought ever that I would leave my faith. And he never expected that. And he never pushed me, never talked about it. So I think it came as a big surprise to him, because I had tried to pretend that my faith was so strong.
There's another element too, where it's happened very rarely, but on occasion I've had somebody close to me, say they've lost their faith. And it isn't necessarily something that I celebrate, in the sense that if you care for that person and their faith has been meaningful for them and comforting for them for years, you're aware of the tumult that is about to happen.
Absolutely. Yes.
And not everyone comes out of that on the other side as better. Right. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I relate to what Jose's reaction. It would take a while to just believe that it's true. And also I imagine he cares for you and knows what it's about to be like.
Exactly. There's a lot of people that need their faith. and would be very lost without it. I thought I would be one of those people. But there's definitely people that I wouldn't want to rip that away from them.
Right.
It's hard. So yeah, he never wanted me to leave my faith because he knew it made me happy, but he didn't know that it had crumbled that much. So I think it finally dawned on him that no, this is for real. I was like, no, dude, this is for real. I am so beyond done. I'm so tired of fighting it and struggling and trying to make it make sense. Like, I'm so done. I'm never turning back. So I proceeded to clear all the books off my bookshelves. I had a lot of Christian books.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
and he's like, are you sure about this? Oh my goodness. He was kind of like, I think he was a little reeling. And then we decided to tell the kids. We said, if you still want to go to church, we'll take you to church. But this is where mommy and daddy are at, and we want to be honest with you. And their response was surprising. My daughter, who's the oldest, said, I've been struggling for a couple of years, but didn't want to voice that to you. She said,
Oh, wow.
it doesn't make sense to me. And I wondered if it was all real. So she's a full-blown atheist now. I told her about, she listens to you in the background to your podcast.
Yeah.
And so she calls it the No God podcast.
Yes.
But whatever they want to believe is fine with us. But they definitely already were on the tracks to not believing. So they were fine with not going to church anymore. But I came to the realization that I had been clinging to my faith for 3 reasons, and realized those reasons just weren't good enough to hold on any longer. I told myself, like, I'll just believe, or hold on to my faith, even if it doesn't make sense, because, there's nothing to lose. But I realized like there's so much to lose. If you're a dedicated Christian and you're spending all that time worried about what God wants you to do and what God thinks, you're wasting a lot of time here on earth. And if you're spending all that time indoctrinating your children, you're wasting a lot of time if it's not real. So I realized there is actually a lot to lose. And then the reason, though, I was still holding on to my faith was, one, because it was what I was taught. 2, because I was comfortable in it and I was a good Christian and I liked it. And the third reason was I was scared to live life without it. And when I evaluated those things and realized if I hadn't been raised a Christian, I wouldn't be one, I realized I was only a Christian because that was how I was raised, and that's not a good enough reason to still hold on to it. And I had based my Christianity on other people's experiences with God and didn't have those actual experiences myself. And I couldn't base my entire life on other people's experiences anymore. And so I determined in that moment, like, if there's a God, I'm going to base it on my own experiences with him.
Mm-hmm.
And if I find proof or evidence that it's real, I'll believe. But as of now, I haven't found anything. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not knowing.
Wow. I think you are the Christian's nightmare, because you did everything right? You did everything right. You were the good kid. You were the good girl. You were, you doubled down. You worked at it. You volunteered. You taught your children, and then fought it to the bitter end. And I just can't imagine like what a struggle that would be, right? Like I have my own experience, but it's different than yours. And the honesty of, articulating it the way that you are, of, I had these reasons and I now see those reasons as invalid, is amazing. So Hannah, the way you described this, you acknowledged that it was a long time coming, but there was kind of a sudden recognition.
Yeah.
But what were some of the things that besides Jose's deconversion that led to this? What were you thinking about?
I guess anytime, like I said, I picked up the Bible, there were just things that didn't ring right to me. I was very confused. So it was like, 6 years worth of so many things.
Mm-hmm.
But the big things were when I started wondering about inspiration of scripture. And I was like, I don't really know, like, I don't find enough proof in the Bible that it's inspired of God. And then once you wrestle with that, and once inspiration kind of falls apart, then it's kind of like, okay, what else is not true?
Yeah.
I always struggled with like the canon and how the Bible was put together,
Yeah.
wondering like, okay, they kind of pick and chose what books they wanted, that aligned with their belief system. And that doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah. It's truth by committee.
Yes.
Yep.
And that just didn't fly for me. I really struggled with, as a parent, I would be in women's Bible studies and read parenting books, and it was inundated with, we can do nothing good apart from God. Like, you cannot, parent well or do anything well without God's help. And I struggled with that so much because I felt like when I would try so hard to lean on God, like, oh, I'm a bad parent, I need to lean on God, or I do this wrong, I need to lean on God more, or pray more. But it didn't seem to be working. And what I found was Jose practicing his mindfulness and meditation. That was working better than me praying and crying out to God.
Yeah.
And I struggled because I thought, there's a lot of things that I'm proud of that I've worked hard on. And I don't know if I can give God the credit for that. Like,
yeah.
I feel, and there's so many people I know that are not Christians that don't rely on God, that are amazing, good people. So good cannot just come from God. That's something I struggled with. And then I really struggled with prayer. I would say my whole life I struggled with prayer. Like, I hated it. I never felt like God heard me. I felt like I was wasting my time. The Bible verse, it's so long ago, but that God will not hear you if you have sin in your heart. As a child, I took that to heart. So I thought, well, I got to confess every single sin to God before he hears me. And so I never really felt like God could hear me because I thought there's, so much sin in my heart that he'll never hear me. So, and then I didn't understand how it worked. And during the 6 years after Jose deconverted, I tried to make sense of prayer. And people would say, well, this is how it works, or this is how it works. Like, do you pray enough and it tips the scales in your favor? Do you just pray so God will change your heart? Like, it didn't make sense.
I cannot tell you how much this is part of my story. So I think I've mentioned before, my favorite Christian author was Philip Yancey, and he often would delve into areas of doubt and the silence of God and that kind of thing. But a couple of years before my deconversion, I was reading his book on prayer, and here's this very intelligent, very dedicated believer twisting himself and not trying to explain why prayer is useful on any level.
Yes.
And failing to do so. And much respect to him. He was trying, but I could not see how many holes there were in the argument. And
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's so true. And my mom has this amazing faith. Like, we always would joke, tell mom to pray about it because God listens to her for some reason. But my mom's faith is so strong that, she'll go to the store and pray that there will be a white pair of shoes, size 9 for her daughter, or parking spot clothes or whatever. She'll pray for, the randomest things, and, always says, well, God will do these things. And I really struggled with that, as most of us do. Because it was like, okay, so God does not care about the little girl down the street that's getting molested every day. But God cares that you find your white pair of shoes. Like, I I struggled with that, especially because I felt like I had such a good life. I have a good husband. I have healthy children. We live in the freedom of America. I'm a white, person that's never encountered racism. Um, I feel like I have so many good things going for me. And is it because God loves me so much?
Mm,
Or is it because I was just pretty darn lucky?
yeah.
I think it's because I was lucky. I have a good life. And it's not because God loves me more than some person in the Middle East that's being separated from their family right now. It's because I was just lucky. So I struggled with that. I struggled with God having a purpose in everything. There was a family in our church whose daughter got run over by the father by accident.
Mm,
She was 3 years old. And, the people in church would say, God has a purpose in this. And the parents would say, we're trying to figure out, what God's purpose is in this. And that, all the stories of all the hardship and heartache in this world really made me pause, because I was like, no, I don't think a loving father would let that happen.
yeah.
Like, there is no good reason for God to let a father run his own child over. There's nothing
Yeah.
good that can come from that. So God does not have a purpose in anything. Crap just happens. And maybe some people feel comforted that God has a plan, but it was the opposite for me. Like, I think I feel better knowing that bad things just happen and there's no great purpose.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that is so pervasive beyond Christianity.
Mhm.
You can have any spiritually but not religious person say, everything happens for a purpose, and I think it's not, exploring the implications of
Yeah,
that. I agree with you. I am much more comforted in the randomness of the universe
for
than
sure.
than trying
Yeah.
to make sense of atrocious tragedy and pain and
Yes.
suffering.
Yes. Totally agree. It's amazing that we're just little specks in this universe. And I find that much more comforting than that God created me for a purpose. That's a huge weight.
One other thing I wanted to respond to is, I think, again, I'm commending you in that I think the hardest thing for a white person, middle class America to recognize is that the success and the relative comfort that they live in is a lot of luck, and not because God loves them and has opened all those doors for them. That's very hard to recognize. And
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of people out there that think God's just blessed them. We're
yeah,
#blessed, but that's not the reality, because if you think you're #blessed, then what about, you have to look at the other side of the coin.
right.
Look about, what did all these people do wrong then? Because their lives are not blessed. Um, I I think I also struggled with um, that God made us for his own glory and to give him glory.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what an egotistical God.
Yes.
Like, I don't want to worship a God like that. But, you know, you
Yeah,
sing the praise songs, and then when you actually think about them, you're like, this is he's kind of a jerk, to be
yeah.
honest. Um, and then I do I have had a few people mention to me that, well, you were raised in a really legalistic church, you and Jose. So maybe you turned from God because you never knew the real God, who's a God of love. And I want to be like, so a God that sends people to hell, good
Yeah,
people to hell, lots of good
yeah,
people to hell, a God that, toyed with Job and toyed with Abraham and his son just to prove a point, a God that never condemned slavery or sexism, a God that allowed mass genocide in his name, you know, um, a God that just let people murder people for no good reason. Like, when they say you don't know the real God, I think you must not read the Bible.
mm, wow,
Because God is not the fuzzy wuzzy Jesus Christ that loved everybody.
Yeah.
Um, there's definitely an awful side to God, that, yes, we did read about. So we do know who God is. And
Yeah.
it's not because of legalism or strict churches that we left our faith. It was because, no, we do see who the God of the Bible really is. And we can't worship a God like that.
Hannah is not playing. No,
No, it's not.
that's
No.
that is an amazing, succinct way to say it. I think as we are watching deconstructions and deconversions occur at a much more rapid pace, there's a desperate attempt by the established Christian church to explain it away. And
Mhm.
one of those tactics is always, well, I wouldn't believe in that God either. You should believe in the
Yeah.
God I believe in. And,
Yes.
some slight variation, that's different between them. And the point is, as you point out, the source material is a problem, and the
Mhm.
Bible itself is damning.
Yes. Yes. So now, I mean, a year in, like, I've never experienced in my 33 years the peace that I have felt since I said goodbye to all this. Like, I've fully embraced the not knowing, and I feel like the shackles are off. Definitely, it's been an easier experience for me because I have my husband.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how hard it is when you feel alone. But thankfully I have him. But I always I always wanted purpose in my life, and before, God was my purpose. But now I've like tried to figure out, okay, what is my purpose now? And it's to be true to myself, which is uh, has been part of this process, which is hard for me because I'm a people pleaser, but I'm working on it.
Yeah.
And also to just soak up the beauty of this world around me and to treat other people with kindness. And that's my new purpose because I feel like I need to have a purpose. So
But you get to decide what that is.
yeah.
Yeah.
And my personality is super people pleasing. I want everyone to like me and understand me. But in this year of becoming an atheist in our very Christian family and community, leaving my Christian identity behind has helped me to grow unashamedly and proudly into who I am. And I feel like I've grown so much in this year. And I read this quote recently that hit me for
Okay.
for anyone else that is also a people pleaser and wants everyone to understand them. I read this quote that said, "Life became a lot simpler when I decided just to let some people misunderstand me."
Ooh,
And
that's a good one.
I'm learning for the first time in my life to be okay with being misunderstood.
Why do you gotta out me like that? The communicator in me is like, oh,
Oh, I know. Oh,
yeah,
I have so much I want to
yeah,
say, and I'm like patting Jose on the back because I'm like, dude, you did so good not trying to like convince me or say anything. Or he's very good about just letting people disagree with him. But I'm kind of like, I gotta prove this. you know,
right.
I gotta have people understand that I'm not just a jerk that left my faith. But there's very, very good reason for
Yeah,
it.
yeah. So as we wrap up, just one kind of last question is, I'm curious, and maybe this is too personal, but how did this affect your relationship with Jose? Did you guys get closer? Do you feel quote unquote spiritually more aligned with one another? What was that like?
Definitely we feel so much closer. We lost that spiritual bond when he left the faith, and that was hard.
Yeah,
But now we feel so connected. He can finally talk to me about all the things that are in his head
yeah,
that I wouldn't let him talk to me about before. So it's been so good. We feel like we're on a really good path figuring out what we want for our lives and for our family. And it's really been amazing. I've told some family and friends, little by little, and that's been hard. the people I don't want to ever find out are my parents, because I feel like that would really crush them.
Hmm.
But they might end up finding out, because I do like to live an authentic, truthful life. So
Yeah.
we'll see. I just don't like to hurt people unnecessarily.
Yeah. Man, I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
Well, Hannah, this has been absolutely amazing. I think there are going to be so many people that relate to your personal story. And then I know there are so many listeners that are in unequally yoked relationships. And so a little bit of hope
Yes.
that you've provided there today.
Yes. I hope this reaches someone that feels alone, because I think your podcast is just so amazing. Your blog, because it shows people in those early stages that, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. I've
Mm,
got this. There's a future beyond faith, and I can be happy and at peace.
fantastic. I couldn't say it any better. Hannah, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Final thoughts on the episode. Wow, Hannah's story is amazing. From growing up so deeply involved in Christianity, she joked about playing Jesus in the Easter play as a baby, being homeschooled, having a purity ring, trying to dedicate her life to God in its entirety, ultimately becoming a pastor's wife as a young woman and thinking that maybe that was the pinnacle of what God had in store for her, only to a few years later find that her husband no longer believes. That would be absolutely devastating. I know there are many of you listening who are in unequally yoked relationships, including me, as you well know. I'll talk more about this in the upcoming Secular Grace Thought of the Week section, but what I want you to grasp at this moment is the devastation that Hannah must have felt during those years. She talks about focusing on her own faith, focusing on her children's faith, doubling down, trying desperately to make prayer work. She gives up on changing Jose's mind. Ultimately, I think that Hannah is a object lesson for those Christians who say that you never really had a real faith. She did absolutely everything right. She had dedicated her entire life to God, and yet it was not enough. A few things that she said that really leapt out at me about the paradigm shift of suddenly knowing someone who she respected and loved who didn't believe. And that's the first time in her life that she really knew someone who didn't believe. The mythos within Christianity is that the non-believers are lost and evil and bad and horrid people. And as soon as you have contact with the humanity of someone, that begins to break down. I was very struck by her children's questions about the Trinity and her inability to respond to that. Again, this shows the fragility of Christianity, not malintent by her children. They were asking legitimate questions and were curious, like children are. But again, it reveals the fatal flaws within Christianity that even a child can reveal with a innocent question. The doubling down is such a common impetus. I think we all have felt that. I'm going to pray more. I'm going to read my Bible more. I'm going to evangelize more. I'm going to dedicate to ministry. And in Hannah's case, reading the Bible is what really brought it home for her that the God that's within the Bible is terrible. If you take off the rose-colored glasses, as she put it, she was now reading it as, is this true? With the question. It was a completely different book, in her words. That mimics a lot of what my experience was like, of reading the Bible through without assuming the truth of it. It comes across as a completely different book. And then lastly, she talked about being much more comfortable with the randomness of the universe than having to have everything have a purpose. I think this is really important, that the burden that she described of having to make everything meaningful or have a purpose behind it. And God seemed to be more attentive to people's parking spots than children who were suffering, and trying to make sense of all that. When you finally lay that down, it's incredibly freeing. I want to commend both Hannah and Jose for their love for one another. I think that is what has brought them through. As we mentioned, I will be interviewing Jose. I'm looking forward to that. It will be great to get both sides of this relationship and hear what he was thinking while he was going through it as well. I want to thank Hannah for being on the podcast, for sharing her story. It was so powerful. I think many, many, many of you will relate. I know that I did. Thank you, Hannah, for telling your story. The Secular Grace thought of the week is about being unequally yoked. I know there are so many of you out there that are in a relationship where your partner still believes and you have either deconstructed or deconverted, and trying to maintain those relationships can be tremendously difficult. I'll mention again my caveat that I think is important, that you are not obligated to remain in a relationship, even if you're married. Just because that marriage contract is there doesn't mean that you are stuck. And if in any way that relationship is abusive, emotionally, physically, sexually, in any other way, you are free to go. So I don't want anything that I'm about to say make someone feel trapped. But if you go through that deconstruction, deconversion process, and you find that you love this person, you want to remain in the relationship, I think there's some things that we can learn from Hannah and Jose's story. Off mic, Hannah mentioned to me that she was so proud of and thankful to Jose for effectively backing off. In her story, she mentioned that Jose basically went through the motions. He went to church. He pretended, basically, to be a Christian. That gave her the space. It did not put her in a defensive mode to begin to think, to begin to see the cracks on her own. I think Jose is a man after my own heart. I feel like I am doing something very similar in my relationship. And even if my wife, Michelle, never deconverts, it's important to me to support her and to give her space and to not have her feel like I am judging her and not have her be in a defensive position whenever we are talking about matters of religion and spirituality. We've said many times that we, the deconverts, may need to have secular grace and be the bigger person in the relationship. And I am convinced that over time that has an impact. Again, I'm not promising you that your partner will deconvert like Hannah did, but that can facilitate a rich and loving relationship that will be valuable on its own, regardless of what you believe and what your partner believes. The hope that I hear in Hannah and Jose's story is not necessarily that our respective partners will deconvert, but rather that they were able to love one another during that time, and that love endured over the religious indoctrination. My old sign-off message was grab someone you love and tell them how much they mean to you. Why don't you do that? Tell your partner how much they mean to you and how much you love them. And if it's safe and comfortable, tell them it's regardless of what they believe or what you believe. So we're going to have one episode in between Hannah and Jose's stories. Next week, there's going to be an episode with Jimmy, Colin, and I as we review The Truman Show, which has an amazing amount of analogy to deconversion. To make that more interesting, if you get a chance, I think it's available on a few free streaming channels. Watch that show and then listen to the podcast next week. And then the week after that, we will have Jose on to tell his side of the story of he and Hannah. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, You can Google deconversion. You can Google secular grace. You can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.